Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, thank you. Thank you for being here today and for all of our attendees on Zoom as well. I am absolutely thrilled to introduce to you today our distinguished visiting lecture series speaker, Dr. Eraka Bath. Dr. Bath is a professor in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and the Vice Chair for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute in the David Geffen School of Medicine. She's a triple-boarded psychiatrist certified in child and adolescent, adult, and forensic psychiatry. Dr. Bath obtained her undergraduate degree at UC Berkeley, go Bay Area, her medical degree at Howard University College of Medicine, go HBCU, and completed her general psychiatry training at St. Vincent's Hospital in Manhattan, an affiliate of New York Medical College. She completed her fellowship in child psychiatry and forensic psychiatry at the NYU School of Medicine, where she was on the faculty prior to returning to California to join the faculty at UCLA. In 2007, she joined the UCLA faculty, and since that time, she has served in multiple leadership roles, including Director of Child Forensic Services, and was a psychiatrist appointed to the LA County Juvenile Mental Health Court. She's also developed multiple partnerships with the Los Angeles County Juvenile Court System, providing consultation and training to the Juvenile Delinquency Court System and the LA County Department of Probation. She's an attending psychiatrist to the Westside Regional Center, providing psychiatric treatment and assessment to individuals with intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum, and developmental disorders across the lifespan. She has a long-standing interest in healthcare disparities, minority, and community mental health, with particular interest in the underserved populations of foster youth and youth in contact with the legal system. Dr. Bath specializes in diagnostic assessment and forensic consultation with adolescents, with an emphasis on youth with history of trauma, including commercially sexually exploited young women. She has, on top of all this, a very strong portfolio of research that has included funding from the NIH, National Institute on Drug Abuse, PCORI, and LA County Department of Probation. Her research expertise includes family-based interventions for judicially involved youth and adapting emerging technologies to increase engagement in court-referred mental health and substance use treatment, particularly for youth impacted by commercial sexual exploitation. And her service in terms of the area of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion has included serving on the DGSOM Diversity Oversight Committee, as well as the Psychiatry Diversity Interest Group. And over the last decade, she has been active in organized psychiatry and served on multiple committees at the national level. She's currently co-chair of the Children in Law Committee for ACAP. And for those of you who have submitted to the Journal of ACAP, American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, JCAP, also noticed that she is an established editor in that journal as well. I've had the great honor, in closing, because I don't know if you can tell, but we are really in for a treat today. I just want to say that I've had the great honor to be close colleagues with Dr. Bath for almost a decade now. And I can say with great authority that you are going to have a very unique opportunity today to hear Dr. Bath speak about her incredibly fierce, passionate, and committed work in the space of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. She is a formidable and unstoppable leader in this space and has already paved the way and set the example for many generations in academic medicine to come on how to make significant advances in JEDI work with agility, utmost grace, and infinite courage. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bath as she talks about to us the fierce urgency of now.
Wow, Marina, thank you for that beautiful introduction. Okay, I'm going to just start with the land grant acknowledgement to pay respect to ancestors and elders past, present, and emerging. And as Dr. Toulouse Shams tried to do, we're going to do a little call and response to warm us up. So, because we are all African. So there's a tradition that says when the speaker comes, can I have your attention? And they're going to say, ago. And as the listeners, you're going to say Ame. Yes, we are listening. So I want us to practice that. Ago. Ago. Yes, thank you. These are some of my disclosures, but I actually prefer to introduce myself with a reflection on my positionality and reflexivity. And so this is a power wheel that shows intersecting axes of power, privilege, and oppression. And I think you'll know more about me if I sort of share with you aspects of my personal and social identities, because that really impacts how I come to the work that I do. So I identify as a Black, cisgender, heterosexual woman. I'm an African descendant of enslavement with Caribbean roots. I'm the granddaughter of domestic worker. I'm a merchant seaman. I'm a mother to a teen daughter. I'm a second generation physician. My parents were both physician activists. I've worked in predominantly white institutions my entire academic career, primarily specializing in juvenile legal and child welfare system. Identify as an inveterate bridge builder, aspiring good champion, a poet, and of course an HBCU medical grad. So now you have a little bit more texture to my orientation and what we're going to talk about. This is a snapshot of some of my current projects, particularly in the JEDI space. I think people who do DEI, we use the term JEDI at UCLA, but people who do this work tend to be a little bit oversubscribed because there's just so much work to do, but it's a lot of opportunity. And really today, some of our learning objectives are, I really want you to understand the fierce urgency of now, which is really a call to action. So many things are under assault and we just can't let our foot off the gas pedal. So I want you to really have an appreciation of the history and need for JEDI work in academic medicine, from workforce development to patient care. I want you to have increased fluency around some ancestral terms and practices that really help guide me moving forward in the work, and really concrete approaches that may be of use. And so when we talk about JEDI, we at UCLA, we added the term justice, but it's really this notion of everyone deserves equity and rights and opportunities, the right to good health. And really the justice aspect of it really is like a verb for us. Thinking about these cultural frameworks that I think are really important, that I've been learning more about as I go in my sort of JEDI journey, is really starting with Sankofa. So this is the notion of looking back. So this is a Ghanaian symbol, and it's a bird who's always looking behind. And it's really the notion of rejecting the ahistorical and making sure that you take the lessons of the past and move them forward. The concept of ubuntu is the interconnectedness of all of us. And so it really recognizes that a person is not a person without other people. And so really in thinking about this work, you need to embrace the notion that we're all interconnected and our shared humanity is what really helps us move forward. This is very similar to the concept of In Lakesh, which is a Mayan concept. And it's, you are my other me. If I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. So if I love and respect you, I love and respect myself. So again, it's that interconnectedness. The Hebrew phrase Tikkun Olam is also a guidepost for me in terms of thinking about healing the world. And so really using that as a North Star and addressing that in my work. The concept of kintsugi is really thinking about the beauty and the broken. Right now, there are a lot of aspects of our society that are broken. And this concept really is a Japanese concept where you use gold to repair. And so I think of this as a big opportunity. We use this in some of our restorative justice work, but that there's opportunity for repair and there's beauty in the broken. And last is Sawubona, is the notion of seeing each other. And so that's a really key critical component if we want to really recognize each other's humanity. So in terms of thinking about the fierce urgency of now, this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King has always been something that really resonates with me. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. And that's true. racism is a public health emergency. We've had multiple agencies throughout our country, both in organized medicine, really highlighting this, from the NIH to the American Medical Association, AAMC. And so it's really critical to sort of embrace that and start to address it with energy and urgency. And this is not only sort of, we think about it at the academic medical center level and some of our professional organizations, but also thinking about racism as a public health threat, because many cities around the country have actually declared it and have legislated around this. And this is really thanks to the work of Dr. Kamara Jones. And really, racism costs us a lot of money. It's estimated that there would be close to 80,000 less deaths per year if Black longevity was equal to whites. And if we think about just what we would gain in terms of the economic eliminating healthcare disparities, it's estimated that we would gain $230 billion per year. And so people familiar with Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, it's really this notion that racism costs everyone, and it's really zapping our society of potential. So there's a financial argument to really address structural inequity. When we think about equity, and people really like to think, okay, let's focus on equality. And there's this narrative, right, that we are living in a meritocracy, but that's a fallacy. And so really not everyone is starting at the same level. And so equality really is not something that's going to help us. And so when we think about, historically, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it did not really fill the hole. If we look at the gaps between people who have privilege and advantage, there's laws, there's practices, policies, procedures, there's generational wealth, all of these things that actually structurally advantage many. And so the world isn't equal, and America is not a meritocracy. And this is even more amplified for people who have intersectionally marginalized identities. And so I think the schematic, which actually shows the whole and the boxes of privilege, really help amplify that. And then really thinking about bias and systemic racism, right? So within the whole, you have this sort of shaky ladder of all these different threats that are constantly intersectionally aggravating someone's marginalization. And so thinking about, people experiencing harms, concentrated poverty, most people in the sort of pipeline, if you will, have all these underlying challenges, which often aren't addressed by our structures. So, what could we do is how do we fortify these things? But really, these efforts are also under attack. I love this old quote by Thurgood Marshall, who really highlights that this fallacy in the notion of people pulling themselves up by the bootstraps, because really, it's like we got where we are usually because of nepotism, cronies, people really bending down to help us pick up our boots. So really thinking about how we can structurally embed equity practices and resist this. So what might be some goals for promoting JEDI in academic medicine? Well, what about having a workplace that's more innovative, twice as likely to exceed its goals, having less attrition for your employees? And so really, that's what we've been trying to do at UCLA, is thinking about really the bonus for our workforce. So if you're interested in these things, if you don't buy the sort of argument that diversity is important, really, if you think about just innovation, that should be an indication that JEDI should be of interest. And really, there's lots of evidence, right, that having a more inclusive workforce really increases patient-centeredness, helps health, wellness and promotion, really reduces disparities. And so we really need, at this time, a workforce that reflects the population, but we're so far from that. So if we look at basically the amount of underrepresented in medicine male, so this is people who are Black, Latinx, Pacific Islander, Native American, and we look at these sort of rates of rise over the years, you can see how low URM is still. So 55 years after the Civil Rights Bill, we do have more diversity, but little equity for URM in terms of full-time faculty in medical schools. If we think about the total number of physicians and total population of the US that are Black, we see that these are really sort of persistent gaps. So my understanding is that 5.8% of physicians are Black in the US, and that's really barely budged. And there's been more women, Black women, who've been becoming physicians, but that's not really enough to fill these gaps. And, you know, why do we need more diversity? Well, unfortunately, there's the workforce implications are really health equity implications. They're public health implications. So this paper that came out really showed that having a single Black primary care physician in a community can have positive rates on the mortality of an entire population. And so workforce inclusive excellence matters in terms of life saved, right? Maybe some people were familiar with a study that came out a couple years ago that looked at having Black babies were more likely to survive with Black doctors than white doctors. Again, thinking about women surgeons, right? Yes, does gender really make a difference? Yes, female surgeons actually have better outcomes, lower rates of complications, readmission, and mortality. Another paper, I'm looking at linguistic concordance impact on patient outcomes. So having that matter. So how can we get to a point, right, where it doesn't matter what language you speak, what your identity is, but that people have equal health outcomes? We're not there yet. Also thinking about racial concordance again. So this is that same study. And so looking at our AAMC data, out of 12,000 or so psychiatry faculty, just 14% are BIPOC women and 6.7% are URM women. So the numbers are really low. I participate in different trainings at the AAMC, and there's a group on diversity inclusion. And I remember going to a meeting around salary and equity. And I learned the stat that freaked me out because it said that basically 0.93% of full professors in academic medicine are Black women. So I wasn't even 1%. I'm a newly minted full professor, but I was shocked, right? And so this is what I'm talking about when I want to underscore the fierce urgency of now. And really, we need to stop weird science. So we have a weird problem. Are people familiar with Joseph Henrich's work? But it really showed how only 12% of the world's population is weird, Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies. And over 96% of the samples in our top journals are on these weird people. And so if we really want to move the needle in thinking about health equity, we need to move from weird to real. And so we like to say race conscious, equity minded, accessible, and linguistically concordant. And really, and thinking about the why, right? This notion of epistemic injustice. And so when we don't have adequate representation from our population, from people with lived experience, there's a notion that there's only certain ways of generating knowledge and who has the power, who are the gatekeepers, right? And so there are many instances that we can look at where people of marginalized identities are often disenfranchised from actually having knowledge about their own illness. If we look at the examples of Serena Williams, who was saying that she was experiencing chest pain, shortness of breath, but people didn't really listen to her. If we think about that from the lens of Black maternal mortality, like people who are allowed to be knowers. And so one of the things I think that's incredibly important about workforce diversity and also thinking about healthcare outcomes is really sort of thinking about knowledge production, who are the gatekeepers of knowledge, and increasing that landscape. Okay. I'm going to skip this video of Scott Page, but I encourage you to check out his work. He's an economist at MIT, and he's written several books. He has great TED Talks, but he talks about the sort of mathematical rationale for diversity that is just really good business. And so if you want to solve a problem, get a bunch of different people in a room, you're going to have a lot better outcome. So let's talk a little bit. If we have time, we can go back to that video. What are we doing in psychiatry? So this is my team, Dr. Enrico Castillo, Dr. Karina Rodriguez, and Jackie Duong, and we are really trying to do the most in many scenarios. And so really in terms of thinking about at UCLA, the sort of notion of justice, historically, most academic medical centers focus on a tripartite mission, but we're trying to add the social accountability arm. So normally it's clinical education and training and research, but the social accountability arm is really important. Now, I feel like at UCSF, you guys have been way more advanced in thinking about justice, and you were earlier as a health anchor network. We've recently joined, but this, that's the justice arm, is this sort of social accountability aspect. Some of the work, I became vice chair in 2018. I was the first departmental vice chair of JEDI in the School of Medicine at UCLA, which was an interesting time in 2018. And really, I would say since then, my roles and demands in that space have grown. And people are more JEDI centered to a degree in academic medicine. There's been, post-COVID and George Floyd, there's been more emphasis on this. And so I've been able to kind of build a plane as I'm flying it, is what, a lot of people describe this work as doing. And so one of the things we did was, I contacted colleagues, some here and some at Davis, how do I, start this role? And really getting a committee and being in community, ubuntu, in Lakesh with like-minded people. And so we created a Psychiatry Diversity Advisory Committee. We had a mission statement as our charter. I was lucky to have the support of my former chair in order to do this. And so this was our initial mission statement. But we've had a lot of drama at UCLA. We've been in the news quite a bit, both in the Department of Psychiatry and also at the university level at large, and also in the medical school. And so this notion, really intention in terms of being a place that's been really hospitable to this work, but also experiencing a lot of threat. And really, I came up with this schema with some colleagues around this sort of power paradox, right? This notion of people really wanting to advance the work, the tension that the institutions have in being able to support the work, and this feeling of, institutional betrayal. And I think people experience this. I mean, I feel like we've made so many inroads in what we are able to do, but at the same time, there's a lot of gaps in terms of that advancement. And so I wanted just to highlight the sort of notion and the importance in terms of people who are in this room or on the video who have leadership positions where you can sort of tweak the levers and use your positionality to advance justice. And so there's this inherent power paradox that we go through. And then in terms of thinking about climate, right? We've been really intentional about creating affinity spaces for people to feel seen and heard. And really, I wanted to highlight this notion of thwarted belongingness, right? And how climate factors actually increase, can either be drivers of attrition or retention. And people really, I think, don't think about that. Many of the times when the Office of Faculty Affairs are reporting their stats on what percentage of faculty are here and there, they're not really looking at attrition, right? They're not looking at retention. And so one of the things we've done is we've really pushed our deans to actually look at attrition. What is the gap in pink and black in particular? Which people are leaving? Because our numbers in terms of URM faculty have been the same since the 80s, but there have been a lot of people hired, people are leaving, right? And so there's inequitable resources applied in terms of keeping those people there and thinking about some of the sort of forces that are drivers. And so really thinking about climate as this just as we're recycling our plastics and other stuff, how can we sort of be intentional around climate management? And so I'm, our current interim chair, who's a really wonderful person, Dr. Helena Hansen, I think has answered the roll call in a lot of ways. And so she has helped facilitate thinking about structural change by really flipping this, schema that I came up with, which is like a triangle. And so much of the time, leadership are kind of top down, pushing on the people deciding, and there's not this sort of inclusive partnership with community, with faculty members who have less seniority. But she's actually really embraced a shared governance model, which I think has facilitated structural change. So there's much more participation in decision making, and that helps people's sense of belonging and inclusion. In terms of thinking about some of the zones that we've been innovating in, I'm just going to spotlight a few sort of programs. So we're fortunate at UCLA in that we've had, as part of the sort of JEDI makeover, we now have a vice dean of JEDI who really mandated that every department in the medical school have a JEDI figurehead, vice chair. And each of those departments needs a committee. And every year, the committee and department has to come up with a JEDI plan and report out. And there's almost like a JEDI Olympics. I call it JEDI Hunger Games, but everyone sort of shares their plan and they get voted on, and then they get money. So these are a lot of structural enhancements that provide resources, right? So you compete for, in the JEDI Olympics, and you can get either 50,000, 40,000, or 30,000, depending on which quartile you score in for your plan. But this is really important because this can't be an unfunded mandate. And as we know, budgets are moral documents. So if you don't fund the work, you don't fund the people doing the work. I get support from the dean's office, like you're not going to get stuff done. So these are the different zones, and we've been able to do quite a bit. So holistic review, in 2018, our department was one of the first psychiatry residency programs nationally to actually implement holistic review. Holistic review has been around for a minute, and really originally was deployed to think about medical school enrollment, and there was less data on how to do it at the graduate medical education level. And so we sort of rolled up our sleeves, we consulted with social psychiatrists, psychologists, but really came up with a pretty state-of-the-art rubric to think about how can we promote inclusive excellence, and what are the things that we think really matter to being a psychiatrist. It's not just MCAT scores, right? It's really distance traveled, it's stick-to-itness, it's persistence, it's all these other things. And how do we quantify that community engagement? And so really we have a couple of peer-reviewed publications, but it's been recognized as one of the most highly detailed and quantitatively systematic approaches to holistic review nationally in psychiatry. And this is just a spotlight of our paper. We also have a visiting elective scholars program. We call it VESP. And really, we wanted to decrease the barriers to medical students actually being able to do a sub-I rotation at UCLA. It's expensive to come to Los Angeles, and really having that opportunity for auditioning in person can help people actually match. When your program like ours, we have 1,500 applicants for just a handful of spots. How can you stand out? And if you are from an under-resourced group, it's going to be harder for you to actually even come and show your stuff, right? And so we established the VEST program. At first, it was just one person, then two, and now we have 8 scholars. And those scholars are actually ranked to match now. So we actually have a handful of scholars who participated in VESP who are actually in the residency. And to date, we've had over 25 scholars. Now, it's really challenging with some of the current administrative pushes on against DEI work. And so we're figuring out how we're going to pivot in terms of keeping this program going and being compliant. Okay, and in addition to actually hosting the students, they also get a $2,500 stipend. So we've increased the amount of financial resource that they get so that they can be here. And there's a built-in network with our JEDI chief residents that they end up getting some mentorship. So thinking about climate, one of the ways, we have a few, but we really are thinking about building community through art partnerships. So my colleague, Dr. Enrico Castillo, has started within the general psychiatry residency curriculum, teaches about structural competency and actually embeds visits to the Hammer Museum, which is a local museum to UCLA, where they get an opportunity to explore some of the themes in vivo at the museum with the curator. And so it's been a really special program. In addition, I've taken like aspects of this, but want to think about our overall community. So our staff, our trainees, and our faculty, and really started what we call Hearts, Healing Equity and the Arts, and really bringing us to spaces to think about social justice issues within a visual landscape. And so many times seeing art and some of the ways in which it conveys messages can be really transformative, and especially doing that shoulder to shoulder with people you work with. And so we've had a lot of different tours to really touch on issues that sometimes are harder for people to talk about, but if you're in a space museum, it sort of gives permission. And so, and this is just a recent exhibit that we, if you're in LA, please go to the Hammer and see the Breathe exhibit that talks about climate and social justice. But artists are talking about the same inequity that we are. And so my goal was to really expand how people can experience these inequities and give them other language. We're also addressing harm through restorative justice practices. And so we've been having, I showed you the slide with all the ways in which UCLA has been in the news. There's been many harms that have happened in our own department. And so using restorative justice as a vehicle to address those. And I would say one of the things I would recommend is sort of thinking about tier 1 work, which is at the bottom. And this is the most preventative form of restorative justice practice, and it's just being in community. So knowing who's in your lab or who's in your workspace, and just having sort of spaces where you share special things about your life or other life, because you kind of want to have that be as foundationally fortified as possible, because that really does mitigate harm happening. And so really trying to not only invest in tier 1 work, but this really equips us for the tier 2 work. We've had to do a lot of tier 2 work because we weren't doing the preventative stuff. So, dealing with microaggressions, macroaggressions end up having us do tier 2 and tier 3. Then thinking about structural equity and how do we sort of apply resources to some of our early career trainees and faculty. And so we've done something called an anti-racism mental health seed grant program. We're currently in our 2nd year. And so these are our first cohort, which we launched in 2021. And it was actually really exciting. Our residents who were graduating in 2020, this sort of summer of 2020, that was very electrifying. And they wanted to raise money to do something. They just felt that they had to do something. And so we ended up using the money to start a seed grant. And this is, spit and grit and teeny tinctures of resource, $30,000 for 3 recipients. So each person gets 10,000, but it's been really transformative to these individuals' careers. And so these are some of our first cohort. We just partnered with Friends of Semel, who is one of our partners in terms of development. And these are our current seed grant awardees, but they're doing lots of different scholarship. And people know, I hope, that there's gaps in terms of funding. We really didn't talk about that in this talk, but it's harder to get funding around JEDI related topics, right? So if you're doing studies which have words like uterus or disparities, those are less likely to get funded. And so how can you, part of the weird science gap actually is creating pathways to fund different projects. So we're excited to be doing that with some of these scholars. Now, thinking about professional development and education for our faculty, we are working with Dr. Uche Blackstock organization. She has Advancing Health Equity, and we are doing department-wide trainings. And I would say, and we sort of think about transformational change, where that change occurs, there's so much that happens underneath the iceberg, right? The invisible labor of, I sometimes call myself a Jedi Yenta, like I'm constantly having to network and really bridge build and form alliances. And that work is all the stuff that happens underneath the iceberg. But just getting buy-in for training to participate has been Herculean. And so since my tenure in this role, I have, provided opportunities for faculty learners, because that's been one thing that's come up over and over again. It's like, how do we have these conversations? How faculty feel nervous that they're going to make a mistake and get canceled, all these sort of experiences. And so we've, kind of in an iterative fashion, moved along the timeline for trainings, but this is what we're going to be working with now with Uche. And it's really, I think, going to be a great opportunity to have a clinically trained person actually provide trainings specifically on health equity for our learners. And so part of that sort of invisible iceberg work is having like work before the actual training. So having learning groups, educating people about the first urgency of now and why we need to do this. Because some people are like, well, we already did the training. They feel like it's a one and done. But I would, the thing I would sort of highlight about JEDI work is that it's ongoing, it's a verb, and that it's this sort of lifelong process to be anti-racist. Okay. I want to share with you something that we've launched. We're the first department in the medical school. So we now have a department community advisory board, and we're really proud of this. And we, again, launched this with around $25,000. We have 19 CAB members from throughout LA County who have different expertise, but we really wanted to, not have such a moat between our investigators and community. So, at UCLA, we're a public land grant institution. We try to claim best in the West, but the amount of community input on our research enterprise is really limited. And many investigators are often struggling, at the last minute to get a letter from a partner, but there's not this sort of true integration where we're really valuing people with lived experience. And we wanted to kind of, our committee break down some of those barriers in terms of starting that. So we started this CAB. These are some of our Psychiatry Diversity Advisory Committee members who helped launch it. And it's really exciting to actually have this. So it's really having both faculty, staff, trainees, and the CAB really not only be a resource for research projects, but also thinking about recommendations around governance. We are in the process of launching a new hospital, and so we're going to really get them involved in actually informing how we operationalize that. So really thinking about it in all of our different domains. These are just some of the areas in which people have expertise. And so it's really a broad group, and they're getting paid, I think, around $150 a meeting. And the goal is to have 6 meetings for the year. And they're, taking it and run with it. Okay. I'm going to advance. We've been doing stuff that's probably relevant to you guys too, is like thinking about Medi-Cal, but I think you guys do that a lot better here. You do, because you have the general, and it's not as like, I don't know, miles away as our enterprise is not integrated at all, but we're trying. And as we think about the new hospital, really trying to sort of integrate that. So I want to just talk about where we are. So this is David Hammond's. It's an image of an American flag. And to me, it's like I've seen it recently. It's called Oh Say Can You See? But it really kind of talks about how we're, this sort of torturous moment in a lot of ways, and how we can sort of do differently, because really DEI, JEDI, it's been in the news and under attack. And so a lot of the efforts that we have been trying to do are really being undermined. And I don't even know what it's going to look like in January, February, March, but it's really sort of thinking about, the challenges are really happening at a national level. And so, fortunately for us, I think a lot of our large organizations have prioritized equity attainment, as a kind of North Star, and we should look to those structures to help advance us. And so, I also think that there's a gap in terms of people being aware of some of these resources. So the AMA has a really beautiful state-of-the-art plan on how to advance equity within your academic medical center. So look at it. You know what I mean? If you're a division director or a leader, and take note. But it really makes us think about, naming structural inequity and then coming up with concrete steps to address it. David Acosta, who's the chief equity inclusion officer for the AAMC, and David Scorton wrote an article actually about making good trouble in organized medicine a couple of years ago, but that this was our kind of, priority right now. And so if we think about how to do that, it's addressing systemic issues, it's activism and advocacy, is thinking about social determinants of health and structural determinants of health, and really working both within our patient encounters, but also outside. So thinking about legislation, calling out to call in, right? Addressing some of the bias-based practices, really thinking about our training, and really making sure that we're embedding information about cultural competency and supporting community-based initiatives that promote equity. So we're trying to do aspects of that, but I encourage everyone to do this sort of self-check and see what they're up to. And so in terms of thinking about these critical elements of racial justice, is this sort of Sankofa notion of making sure you understand the past, right? And how do you sort of anchor that in terms of your transformational change? This slide is from this AMA strategic plan to address equity, and it really, I think, highlights the importance of power sharing and ways to push upstream. So that slide that I showed about shared governance, do you have that model operating within your own institution? How can you shift that? Are there staff who are participating in committees? What about trainees? So thinking about ways to invert that triangle. Okay, I'm just gonna move a little bit here. And so unity is what makes us stronger. This is Faith Ringgold. And so this notion of where we need to go and how we need to sort of stay anchored in togetherness. And I saw this, I was just at Art Basel, Miami Beach, and these are on this, it's like an abandoned, it's supposed to be an abandoned ship, but I felt that it was so critical for this sort of time of now, right? And it's by the artist, what is his name? Nicholas Galanin. And he basically wanted to show a metaphor for the fragility of the empire and failed conquest, and ask us, what are we going to build for our collective liberation? We have to do it in Lakesh, Ubuntu together, and thinking about that as the sort of fierce urgency of now charge. When we think about becoming anti-racist, right, it exists along a continuum, and probably there's different ways our organization and our own behaviors exist along this continuum. But if we think about it in this active sense, like, are we being in the growth zone? Are we pushing ourselves to be in that zone? Like meta questions, is to pause. How can we encourage scholarship? Are we addressing it in our research enterprises? What about in our decision making? Are we looking even at promotions, advancement, retention packages? How are we doing these sort of equity checks, especially when we are in positions of power, right? And so this notion that you can watch people align themselves when trouble's in the air, but some prefer to be close to those at the top and others want to be near those at the bottom. So it's a question of what frightens them and what they want to be like. So that is a question for you to ask yourself, and recognizing that action causes more trouble than thought. So how do we move towards the space of liberatory consciousness? The work of Barbara Love, she is a really key anti-racist scholar and really talks about the sort of 4 A's of anti-racism. So it's awareness, analysis, accountability, and action allyship. And so they're sort of all iterative, but all digitated at the same time. But it's this sort of constant questioning of structures, really being able to analyze them and have accountability, and then doing the work, right? Being active and recognizing that this progress is not linear by any way, shape, or form. And so really, thinking about what is our journey going to look like is really a conversation to be having. And people ask me, well, what do you suggest we do? Are you panicked about this new administration? I say that the people before 50 years ago, my mom graduated from medical school in 1968. It was a much worse time in a lot of respects than it is now. And so I feel very, optimistic as I have all these frameworks and a bigger community, but I'm really kind of ready to roll up my sleeves. And I will end actually with an image of my mom. So she was a faculty member at UCLA in the Department of Ophthalmology. And I found she died in 2019. And going through her archive, and she had a lot of firsts. So she was like the first Black female surgeon at UCLA and the first woman on the faculty in ophthalmology. She dealt with a lot of battles, and it was interesting because when I joined the faculty at UCLA in 2007, I think I was the only Black psychiatrist in the department between 2008 and 2020, which is crazy, but wasn't that different from my mom, you know what I mean, who joined the faculty in 1975. And anyways, I found this photo and I thought it was hilarious because she's total staged photo op, right? And I think that's the sort of spirit of resistance that I want us to think about moving forward, is this sort of cheeky, smiling, graceful, triumphant, and taking space, and she has a quote that's do not allow your mind to be imprisoned by majority thinking. And that's kind of what, I think is really critical, is that we, are limitless in our ability, and we just have to sort of really be close to each other and uplift each other. But really that notion of fierce, resistive persistence and really taking up space is critical. And so with that, I will take questions. Thank you.
Eraka.
Hi. Sorry.
It's so great to see you and hear you. And I have a question for you. So you mentioned unity, and you talked about structure at the institutional level in particular. So it's the case that even with our major organizations like the AMA, the APA, essentially encouraging us to be anti-racist, it's the case that within medicine, there is a lot of division. I'm thinking about your poor mom in ophthalmology, in surgery versus other specialties, there are stark differences in terms of the recognition of what you're talking about. I would say there's even counter pseudo publications, that attack the papers you showed, etc. And so how critical is it to address that within medicine, within or institutions, because I sort of feel like it's almost compartmentalized out of awareness, but at the same time, I think it does trip us and makes us fall, right?
Yeah, so is your question really like addressing the lack of unity?
Or sort of the fact that there's such a stark polarization within medicine, with essentially some people actively ridiculing, if you will, some of the science that you presented.
It's interesting. This just came up. I had to give a lecture on structural racism and health. And one of the residents shared that on their rotation, they kind of got into it their first year with a nephrologist who was still insistent on using some of the antiquated GFR calculations. And so there's been a lot of shifts, right? Like pulse oximeters, all these different ways in which race-based medicine has been shown to cause harms. But this person was very resistive, and despite all the papers, just not budging. And so I connected her to some other nephrology. But I feel like I've noticed being kind of one marginalized person within these kind of very dominant spaces as I've had more leadership roles, that a lot of the leaders who are pretty much, you know, not a diverse group of folks are not aware of a lot of the literature, nor of all the institutions that have really underscored, you know, whether it's the CDC or the AMA. And so that lack of knowledge, and there's not really a push for them to have to know, right? And so part of me wants more in-service for people who are chairs. Like we have this problem at UCLA in particular, like our chairs who are the gatekeepers, the decision makers. Like if the, you know, executive sponsorship is probably one of the most critical levers around justice, of bending the arc towards justice. And I think that there needs to be more, you know, whoever's above them needs to actually make sure that they are participant in learning, because there is a ton of literature. Are they going to like turn their back on what the NIH, they care about the NIH, right? So I kind of take the epistemic justice framework and really try to shock and awe them with the data and all the different agencies that have compelled us to do it. But what's amazing is like there's a lot of cluelessness around that, right? So I don't know, you know, I'm trying, you know what I mean, to promote that unity as much as possible, and then provide the resources, which I think are under accessed and underutilized. Like we really don't know all the breadth of resources that exist there, and we're not sort of embedding them. Like we'll do evidence-based things to deal with COVID prevention, but we're not using the same sort of approach for our JEDI work. And that's really, I think, due to the sort of lack of institutional accountability and oversight. Oh, about the glomerular filtration rate. Yeah, so there are ways in which calculating the scores were thought to be inherently biased. And so there's just sort of a shift change around addressing them. We can talk after and I'll show you.
Thank you so much for the talk. You talked about the feeling of institutional betrayal that comes with doing this kind of work, and the counter narratives that are kind of very much in vogue right now, and I think gaining strength. What have you done, or how have you changed the way you go about this work? Because I think there's probably a lot of criticism that you've faced, you know, especially in spaces that are even allied with your goals. There's a lot of criticism. So I wonder kind of how you've changed the way you go about communicating or doing the work that through kind of the years of doing it.
Yeah, I would say it's been iterative. I think we can think about almost if George Floyd was an inflection point, so has October 7th been, and almost like bookending those moments, you know, public health critical race praxis really gets us to think about what's happening now. What are the contemporaneous conditions? And really trying to cultivate buy-in. I feel like a lot of my work is really being a diplomat in some ways and really trying to meet people where they are and trying to just engage no matter what. And that's really some of the restorative practice orientation, is that every member of community matters, right? So one of my restorative justice mentors, Toni McMurphy, she does a lot of the trainings for AAMC. Someone asked her, like, oh, would you do, restorative circles with, and forgive me if anyone's a Trump supporter, but they asked, would you do it with Donald Trump? And she's like, of course. Like, so every member of the community matters, and you have to create space to like have that dialogue. And so I think right now that's where I'm at, and that's really my role, right? As this, Jedi Tsarina, I have to really be the Statue of Liberty and really welcome all viewpoints and try to create space for them. And that's not always easy, right? And so it also means that I have to check myself and my own sort of biases, which are going to be, flowing every which way. But I do have to sort of like embrace that sort of higher role of really bringing people to the table. But yeah, there are a lot of assaults that I don't even know are coming, and just really trying to not have silos and dialogue. I think the silos are a thing I've been noticing happening much more recently, and really trying to build spaces where there's multiple voices at the table, creating opportunities for decisions to be made with multiple, just thinking about multi-partiality and multiplicity of representation around everything. Because there's a tendency to like result to the mean, which is not an inclusive space, right? So sometimes I'm just trying to stack the room differently, and that's my intervention.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bath, for an incredible and inspiring talk. I'm one of the fourth-year residents here, so happy to hear you this morning.
Okay.
It sounds like with a lot of the JEDI work, it unfortunately has to require a lot of personal investment, whether it's from people in power, like chairs, or just kind of a groundswell of community members to make these efforts be a priority for institutions, which we often claim them to be like these like MF role things that are just here when it's really just all of us collective together that makes up the institution. So I'm just curious, I don't want to put all the responsibility on you to tell me the answer, but like, how can we make this a permanent part of our community, our practices, and not just something that depends on one person to be like, yes, this matters, and that's why we're going to invest in it?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that I'm feel safe, if you will, at my institution is that there's really been an institutional commitment to this work. So I think I shared earlier that in 2021, like there was, in 2020, racial uprisings all around the country, right? And everybody, whether you're Costco or, Lululemon or UCLA, you're writing a statement around racial justice and solidarity. And with that, there were different structural changes at the governance level within the medical school that happened, which then resulted in creating, structures that are upholding JEDI or charged with JEDI work. So the fact that, I've gone to other medical schools, most medical schools don't have every department having a JEDI committee and a JEDI lead who gets 25% protected time for their work, right? And that all the chairs are responsible for a JEDI plan. So I think the thing that I feel like is exciting at UCLA is that there's embedded governance. That means that it's not just up to me, right? There's a committee, there's, my role, I have an associate vice chair, I get to go into spaces with all the other JEDI leads of other departments and get different ideas, that we have meetings with the dean. So there's a lot more resources allocated and structures that allow us to have different conversations and also benchmarks and accountability that didn't exist before. Like when I was I've been on the faculty there since 2007. It's a very different experience. I don't feel like this thwarted belonging that I did, you know, for many years. Like I've been able to build more community. So I don't feel like all the work is on me. And I've also just in my own sort of managing exhaustion and burnout is like try to have a distributive leadership approach so that really enfranchising others to take leadership roles. So the community advisory board that we established for the department was my idea, but like, I don't need to run everything, right? So really looking to people for them to have their own leadership opportunities because it's great. And then they, you know, ran with it. And so really trying to create space and for structured leadership around some of these initiatives as well. And then disseminating, right? So once you disseminate it, it has more traction, and thinking about dissemination in terms of like a digital footprint, pushing that out to departments and then writing about it also. So.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for your attention.